Good afternoon and welcome to Round the Table. My name is Ben John. I work at Christian Concern and the Wilberforce Academy, and it's great to be back with you again for another week, another round of Round the Table. It's a delight to see you all joining us today. Please do make sure that you put in your comments, that you say hello from where you're from. It's always great seeing the broad spectrum of the locations and geographies of where you tune in from. So please do put them in. And today, we'll be looking at the issue of anti-Semitism and how we as Christians can be responding to it, understanding what's been going on in the culture and in the nation. And so with that, delighted to be joined by my colleague, Tim Dieppe, Head of Public Policy at Christian Concern, and Sharon Klaff, who leads Campaign for Truth. It's great to have you both with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. And everyone tuning in, please do make sure you put in your comments, put in your questions. We'd love to be able to engage with you and hear about all that you're doing. Sharon, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, and the current work that you're involved in at the moment.
Okay, so firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to talk with you today. It's always nice to be with friends at a round table. Okay, so I'm, as you can hear from my accent, I'm born in South Africa. I was born during apartheid years, and I came to live in London in 1969. So that was just as a landmark 2 years after the Six-Day War in Israel. And I found in London a quite free society compared to what I'd come from. So I'd come from a society where you weren't allowed to express your views. You were not allowed to speak. You hardly even mentioned your views at home. You were very careful what you said because you could have been arrested or put under house arrest at home or something worse than that. So I know about censorship from first-hand experience growing up in a sense in a police state. So I came to London and it was fairly free. And in those days, those 2 years after the Six-Day War, people were very in favor of Israel. Israel was like the flavor of the world for having succeeded in 6 days to save themselves in that miraculous way and free Jerusalem. And so for some while after that, I think we all began to sort of rest on our laurels in a way and forget about this thing called anti-Semitism, or I rather call it Jew hatred. So we went through probably a decade of not really paying attention, even though there was the Yom Kippur War and so on. Israel was still okay on the surface. And then that changed. It changed drastically later on, probably moving into the 80s and on from there. It changed. And this anti-Semitic sort of wanting to destroy the Jews through destroying their land began to grow. And I guess the pinnacle of it came in 2000 with Durban, the Durban meeting in South Africa, where they declared that Zionism was racism. And I know that they've retracted that since then, but that little phrase stuck there, that Zionism was no longer the desire of the Jews for self-determination like any other nation state, but it now became something that was evil, was racist and evil. And I specifically got involved in action in the 90s when the film The Pianist came out. Because I began to, when I saw that film, as I was horrified at what had happened, but I particularly felt that it was happening again. It kind of reminded me that all those things that my dead relatives had gone through was beginning to happen again. And I was wondering how I was going to protect my children. So I hopped onto the streets and I joined a group of protesters outside the Ahava store in, I can't remember the name of the street now, but in central London, where the very first elements of the BDS, the Boycott, Divest and Sanctions group, was beginning. There were about between 30 and 50 of them. They had their slogan, they had their Palestinian flag, and there were just a few of us there to protest against them without support from the Jewish community. We had no aid from Board of Deputies, from then BICOM that was beginning to grow. And so we would go there every 2 weeks with our Israeli flags. We had no money to do anything. And we would chant against them and they would chant against us. And as much as they were virulent anti-Semites, they were not violent. There was no violence then.
Right.
So that's where it grew from. And Campaign for Truth came out of that, because we felt that if our community wasn't going to do anything, we had to do something. Mm-hmm. And we set our first project, interestingly enough, in 2007 to bring to the world the information about Hamas. Right. And we started going on the streets. We went to Edgware Road and we took placards and we were talking about it and so on. Mm-hmm. And then fast forward to around about 2013, I met Ambrosine, and that's where her eye on anti-Semitism and my Campaign for Truth started working together. That's like a snapshot.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So then you mentioned exposing Hamas all the way back in 2007. And so the reason why we're talking about this, so viewers are aware that if they haven't seen some of the headlines about this rise in recent weeks, really, or over the last few years, but particularly intensive these last few weeks, about anti-Semitic or, as you said, anti-Jew hating behavior. Just in the last few weeks, just reading some reports here, a member of a mob openly said in front of police officers in London, "We'll find some Jews. We want the Zionists. We want their blood." In another incident, a man yelled at a Jewish nurse, "I want to kill all your people." And some protesters had placards with anti-Jewish tropes. And in fact, Nick Timothy wrote in the Telegraph, "Schools have reported huge spikes in anti-Semitic abuse of pupils. In Leicester, gangs of college students were filmed stamping on tables and chanting Allahu Akbar. The intimidation of Jewish pupils and teachers grew so severe that the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, wrote to schools warning that while pupils are allowed to express political views, anti-Semitic language and threats must not be tolerated." So, Sharon, maybe you could speak into a little bit of what's the sentiment at the moment within the Jewish community with this background. I mean, a lot of this has maybe come up with the recent issues that were going on with Israel and Gaza there, and the various attacks that were going on there. That's kind of exploded the situation a bit. What's the sentiments in the Jewish community, particularly in England?
Okay, so this spike in anti-Semitism always arises when there's some sort of war in Israel. So the last big spike, I guess, was 2014, when they had the last big Gaza war. I know there's been stuff going on in between. And what happens when there's a war in Israel is that the Jews here, a lot of Jews suddenly come out of the woodwork, and particularly since there's social media, and they all want to do something. So you find a lot of groups springing up wanting to do stuff, as is happening now in behind the scenes. I can see the names that I met in 2014, and it went silent. It goes like a wave. They get spiked, they do stuff, and then they get a little bit bored with it because everybody feels safe again. And then they disappear, and now they're back again. So a kind of continuous stream of feeling vulnerable doesn't seem to last. It's not something that's in the foreground. I also sense that I've got children and grandchildren, and I sense that they try to protect their children. So they're trying to keep them a little bit away from the front of all the issues that are going on. Since 2014 as well, I think more and more Jewish children are going to Jewish schools. There's a big increase for spaces at Jewish schools. So, for instance, where I live is a very good grammar school, and that's where my daughter went. Very few Jewish kids are going to those schools anymore. They go to Jewish schools, and I think that's a sign that Jews are feeling vulnerable, that they feel they need to be somewhere kept warm in a community, kept safe in a community. What's been going on now in the streets is evidence of what we were saying very openly, that anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and it is anti-Judaism. And the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism is that in anti-Judaism, you don't even have to know a Jew to know that you hate him. You don't know why you hate him, but you know. So, for instance, Shakespeare would never have met a Jew when he wrote, but he wrote about Shylock, and he wrote the traits of Shylock that are in a way, anti-Semitic tropes. So we were saying that.
Merchant of Venice, is it that one? The Merchant of Venice?
Yeah.
Merchants of Venice, I mean, yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So these three are one and the same, and in a way they're used to play off each other, so people can pretend that they're not anti-Semitic, that they don't hate Jews. So they can say, I'm anti-Zionist, it's Israel, it's the Israeli government, it's Bibi Netanyahu. And even now that Israel has got rid of Bibi Netanyahu, they've installed Mr. Bennett. They've installed a party that is Muslim Brotherhood in government, and yet I read today that they hate Bennett even more than they hate Netanyahu. So there's no logic to this. This is just using whatever they can to exonerate themselves from guilt of hate crime, and allow themselves that. I'll put it to you this way. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there's there's something called Motte and Bailey. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's to do with castles and moats around.
Motte and Bailey castles, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's also used in a kind of in psychology and in critical race theory. So what they've got is Motte, which is charity. Right. And what happens is they draw you into their charities. So they have, I'm talking now about the kindness that is dished out of inviting people to dinners. For instance, the Muslims who invite you to iftar dinners, this is a charity. Or recently down the road in the Golders Green Hippodrome, they had a blood bank drive to give blood. They had a COVID drive, and everybody said this is a nice thing to do, which I guess it is a nice thing to do. So that's kind of disarming you in a way. That's the Motte. And then they've got the Bailey, where they jump in once you're disarmed, and they bring to you the ideology that they want you to have. And then they begin to start committing race hate crimes and so on. And this is what we've seen here. We've had the Motte with the Palestinian group, is the idea that these poor Palestinians are being threatened, they're being killed, the Jews are committing a genocide on them, there's ethnic cleansing, all the things that are happening to Jews are being put on to what's happening to Palestinians. And then they come along and they go down our streets and they start attacking Jews, not Zionists, but Jews. So it gives weight to what we say, that anti-Zionism is actually just another word for anti-Semitism. And I'd say anti-Judaism, because I guess the reason they're saying, where are the Jews? Because they never met a Jew. They're looking for big black hats and payot and robes. They're not looking for somebody like me. So this is the psychology that's going on. And I know I'm hogging it now, but something that struck me is that Palestinianism is a brand. It's not even just a group of people who have a political view. It is a brand. It's a brand that's bigger than Nike. And if you look around, I don't know if you notice it, for instance, this green and red appears everywhere. They don't need to say anything. I'm watching a program on cooking, and for some strange reason, the BBC cameraman goes to the shoes of the chefs walking down the passage. And on the side of one pair of shoes is the green and red stripe. So psychologically, subliminally, it's being fed into people that green and red is good and blue and white is bad. Blue and white being Israel.
That's an interesting observation there. I mean, I've noticed that I was seeing footballers carrying their, just a few weeks ago, seeing, Manchester United players, Paul Pogba, carrying his Free Palestine flag and seeing that everywhere, combined with a lot of other colors that represent other things. It is interesting. So that was a really helpful distinction or non-distinction you were making there about the anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism that you're mentioning there.
I mean, I'm with you on that, Sharon, but we're not saying that you can't criticize Israel and that Israel is above criticism. What we're saying is that Israel should, is a valid state and a valid aspiration, and Zionism is a valid aspiration, and people, shouldn't criticize that. And very often, Zionism is, as that quote that Ben read out earlier, the Zionists and the Jews, they link them both together. It's a problem.
I one can criticize anything one wants to criticize.
Yeah.
If you're a politico and you disagree with some country somewhere that you know about and you don't think they should be doing what they're doing, you're fine to have a political view on it.
Yeah.
What is happening here is that if you stop those hordes running down the streets, threatening my daughter with rape, and you ask them what they think about the Palestinians living in Syria who are under attack, if you ask them what they did about the Palestinians in the Kuwait war, do you remember the Kuwait war, Iran war? What happened to the Palestinians there who went along to be servants to the very rich Kuwaitis, how they were treated, how they weren't given gas masks like everybody else was, how they were stuck in dungeons, their passports were taken away from them. I don't hear those people talking about Palestinians living anywhere else in the world who are under threat, except living in Israel. The problem is, in Israel, the Arabs are called Israeli. They're not called Palestinians. If they want to call themselves Palestinians, they're living on the West Bank. They're not living in Israel. They're living in the authority that Oslo gave them over Judea, certain sections of Judea and Samaria. They're living in Gaza, that used to be Egypt. They're not actually living in Israel. So why anybody thinks that Israel's taking away voting rights or water rights or anything from these people, goodness knows, because I know Arabs who live in Israel. I have family.
You've lived in an actual apartheid state.
Yes.
And then, so for you then, then people talk about Israel as if it's apartheid, liken it to apartheid, and even worse, liken it to Nazism and stuff. It's shocking, isn't it, to see that kind of thing happening when there are Arab MPs in the Knesset and all of that kind of thing and so on. It's not racist in that kind of way at all.
It's more than shocking. It's deep-seated anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
It's a hatred for Jews that goes beyond all reason. It's not true. If people who accuse Israel of apartheid are actually reducing the suffering that the black people in South Africa underwent, I know what suffering they underwent. I know exactly how they lived.
Yeah.
I know, for instance, when, as a child, when you drive down the road at night, late on a Saturday night, you would see the African kids in the middle of winter standing on the pavements, barefoot, dishing out newspapers. You could buy your Sunday newspaper at midnight on a Saturday on the street corner from a little kid who had no shoes. That's apartheid. I know that black people used to be shot. They used to be shot a friend of mine had a farm, and on the other end of his farm, he used to hear these pop shots, and they were shooting people and putting them in ditches like the Nazis did to Jews. You don't find that in Israel. It's actually a lie that is so horrendous, but it's accepted because of this Palestine brand. Yeah.
So, Sharon, as you know, I'm very, very concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism across the UK. And I wrote an article about it this week, which I think you've seen, and hopefully my colleagues can post on the chat here, because I want people to see the connection with Islam here. And so the article I wrote was called "Is Islam Anti-Semitic?" And the problem is that if you look at the text, you look at the Quran, you look at the Hadith, you look at the life of Muhammad, it's riddled with anti-Semitism. There's lots and lots and lots of it in there. It's very disturbing to read it. But I've listed the verses, some of the verses, only some of them, and some of the incidents. And there's a whole history of anti-Semitism amongst Islam. And then if you go into surveys, I was quite shocked to find this survey, 2019, in the UK, 11% of the population harbour anti-Semitic attitudes, which I think is really bad. 11% is not a small minority. It's a sizable minority, right? It's millions of people, actually. And then you look deeper and you think, well, amongst the Muslims in the UK, it's 54% harbour anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, that really is shocking and very disturbing, but perhaps not surprising, given the sort of theological link that there is in terms of Islamic theology being anti-Semitic. And so, I was quite disturbed by that, and I wanted to expose it really and show that. And the only good thing that I can point to in the mix of that is the government, according to the Telegraph, is concerned that increasing Islamism is fueling the rise in increasing anti-Semitism, and that perhaps they're recognizing this link, perhaps, and that is positive, but what are they going to do about it is the next question.
So, Tim, I guess the average person on the street probably thinks that the Islamic connection with anti-Semitism really only is going back to this Israel-Palestine thing. Are you saying that there's a history of anti-Semitism more embedded?
Absolutely. It goes back to the Quran. It goes back to saying the worst enemies are the Jews in the Quran, and that's frequently quoted in Muslim situations. It goes back to Muhammad himself saying, "Kill Jews wherever you find them," and deathbed wish there should be no two religions in Arabia, that Muslims have tried to fulfill. It goes back to the whole dhimmi status thing. Sharon, you'll know about that, I imagine, through Islamic history, where Jews and Christians were treated as second-class citizens, having to pay an extortionate poll tax called the jizya tax, and that happened all the way through, including in Andalusia and the Ottoman Empire, and before that in the Middle Ages as well. And Jews were systematically mistreated and maltreated, and beaten without reason, and not able to rise up in society, and even having to wear different clothes very often under Islamic rule, or not allowed to wear shoes. Or one I read recently says having to wear different shoes on your feet. There's a rule for the Jews. You must have different rules. I've just read this book. I don't know if, Sharon, you've read it, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism by Andrew Boston.
Yes.
So it's a big book, and it's small print as well, but it goes through all of this history, and there's so much of it all over the place. I'd recommend other people to read it, because this is well before 1948. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years before 1948, as well as earlier in the 20th century, this was a problem. And there's government reports from the British Mandate saying this is a problem, anti-Semitism. There's so much documentation of this. This idea that it's only come as a result of the Palestinian conflict is just wrong. It's been happening well before that for many, many, many years in the whole history of Islam.
Why then are we seeing generally across and of course, I mean, we've had white nationalism, white nationalist anti-Semitism, we have right-wing so-called anti-Semitism, but why is it to seem that there's this strange partnership between the modern political left and Islam in anti-Semitism? We saw all about Jeremy Corbyn talking about Hamas as our friends. We've seen there's anti-Semitism has been seen as a particular issue within the Labour Party. Where's that partnership come from? Sharon, I don't know whether you'd be able to speak into that.
Okay, so I want to make a distinction before I speak about this, is that I never speak about people. I speak about ideologies, I speak about concepts, I'm not speaking about people. So if I talk about Islamic anti-Semitism, I'm not talking about my very nice friend Muda Zakran, who's a Muslim, or any other person who's a Muslim, or even the innocent people who go along to mosque and pray in a mosque and join in a mosque society. Yep. I'm only talking about the ideology of it. And I have to agree with Tim. I'm not an expert on the Quran. I did start reading it at one stage, and I got halfway through it and felt I couldn't read anymore. It kind of was addling my brain. I'm sorry to put it that way.
I didn't like that.
I couldn't read it. But I do agree, and I have learned that there's people say that, and they bring out passages from the Quran where they talk about the people of the book, and that the Jews must be in Israel and so on. And my understanding is that Islam is basically based on the Torah, on Judaism, that gave it its framework. So yes, there are nice things about Jews there because it came out of that. But there's something in Islam, I understand, called abrogation. And this is because the rules of Islam grew as the society grew, as they went from one area to another area, and the community grew. So, and in order to grow the community, there was a lot of violence. So they had to change this idea that you shouldn't steal and you shouldn't love your neighbor and all of that. So there's something called abrogation. Every time there was a war or an attack or a murder, there was a new rule that came, and the new rule superseded the old rule. That's my understanding. If I'm wrong, somebody will write in and tell me I'm wrong.
It's a bit like for us the New Testament and the Old Testament.
Yeah.
In that way. But it's not so obvious because the Quran is not in chronological order. It's just
it's
in
not
the
in, exactly. It's not in chronological order. I understand.
So you have to sort of have your background knowledge in order to know this stuff. Yeah.
And also I understand that when people go to mosque, most of them have imams who don't actually read in the language that the Quran is written in, so they don't really get what's being said, and they don't pray in the same sense as we do. They don't have prayers like we do. I understand that. That they have narrations and they tell stories, so the imam can tell the story as he heard it. It's almost like a verbal pass me down. And it depends who passed it down. So I'm not criticizing people who adhere to that. I'm only talking about the fact that I feel unsafe. My daughters, or our daughters, have been threatened with rape on the streets of London. There's been a hunt for Jews. Wow. They drove through here, two miles from my house, that convoy from Bradford with the Palestinian flags. You didn't hear about it.
Wow.
They drove through the area of the whole of North London where most of the Jewish people live, and they were shouting for murder of Jewish mothers and rape their daughters.
And this was what, just in the last few weeks?
This was 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
There was a pro-Palestinian rally in the West End. Jeremy Corbyn spoke at it. The head of the teachers' union spoke at it. And the very next day, these hordes drove through North London threatening our daughters. Wow. I am furious. I'm furious, not because of what they do, because they're hordes. Most of them don't even know what they're doing. I'm furious that our police, our teachers, our lecturers are allowing this to happen. I'm absolutely furious. I told you when we started that I was furious. I read a tweet from Robert Halfon, who's a very nice Jewish MP. I think he's in Harrow. He is the chair of the Education Committee, and he wrote an article only last week after a tweet. What was his tweet? How did this happen? He tweeted after these hordes drove through North London. How did this happen? And I have to ask, where has this man been for the last 20 years? He's the chair of the Education Committee. We wrote a letter, Ambrosine and I, to Priti Patel last January, before COVID, and we told them that there was a school in Dagenham that had I hate to call him an ambassador, he had the head of the Palestine mission in the school. We had photographs of school children with Palestinian, you know those Palestinian scarves they wear, those tourist scarves they buy. They had them draped around their necks, proudly displaying on the website of Dagenham School, a Christian school, by the way. And we wrote to Priti Patel about it. We said to her, look what's happening. This school had brought a teacher exchange from Jericho because they were doing a project on rivers. And just as a sideline, I don't believe there's a river that goes through Jericho, by the way. I believe it's just a song. It's not far from the Jordan, but I don't believe there's an actual river that goes through Jericho. But anyway, so they brought a teacher exchange of indoctrinated people from the Palestine administration area of Judea and Samaria into a school for 2 weeks in this country. Can you imagine what those children were taught? And then this head, Mr. Zomlot, who's Jeremy Corbyn was his best man at his wedding. That's how close they are. Mr. Zomlot was removed from America by Donald Trump. He and his family had their visas taken away. Mr. Zomlot is part of the Fatah organization. He's here in the UK. He contacted the school, apparently, according to the teacher, via Twitter, and said, I would like to come and talk to the children. This is what she said. And she allowed him to come. So 2 crimes. The one is to encourage children to respond to Twitter requests to meet them, social media requests. Second one, she brings a man into the school who she clearly said she didn't know before, to come and talk to the children about what. So I am furious. Priti Patel, I can understand, may have ignored it because COVID happened a few weeks later. Robert Halfon wonders how it happened and writes an article that we mustn't allow anti-Semitism in our universities. Well, hello, Mr. Halfon. Our universities have already produced the teachers who are teaching in our schools. And that is why we now have Palestine brand in the schools with the children jumping on desks, calling for death to Jews. This is how insidious this is. I am absolutely furious at our government, not only Boris, but all previous governments that have been party to this. I'm furious at our Jewish Board of Deputies who have ignored this, the Jewish Board of Deputies whose leader terms me as an unsavory person because I talk about this. She won't meet with me. She doesn't like my output. I'm furious with the Jewish Leadership Council. I'm furious with United Synagogue. I'm furious with the whole bank shoot of them because they're too afraid to stand up and listen to what Mehdi Hassan, you know Mehdi Hassan, the journalist, Mehdi Hassan wrote in 2013 an article. I will read you the title of the article. He says, "The sorry truth is the virus of anti-Semitism has infested the British Muslim community." So he called it their dirty little secret. Now, I wager, Mr. Hassan, that it hasn't infested the Muslim community. I wager that it was brought here by some of the Muslim community, that it was brought here because if you go back in history, you go back to the Second World War with the Nazis and the Jews and how they killed the Jews, you know that Haj Amin Husseini was a partner of Hitler. Haj Amin Husseini was the head of
Grand Mufti.
He was the Grand Mufti. They call him the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti in what was called then the Palestine Mandate. It wasn't Palestine. He was the Grand Mufti. He was removed from there. He went to live in Iraq. He instigated in Iraq. He went to Germany. He was a friend of Hitler's. So I'm afraid that this Islamic anti-Semitism has not just arrived in the UK. It is part of what it's about. It's part of the proselytizing, of converting people to Islam. I can't say more than that. And once again, Jews are at the butt end of it.
And what you're doing a great job, Sharon, and Ambrosine with you who works for Eye on Anti-Semitism in exposing this stuff, and we're keen to help and sympathize very much with what you're trying to do and stuff. What else would you like to see people do, or would you if you were head of the Board of British Deputies, what would you be doing, or if you were the government, what would you be doing?
Okay, so in 2015 there was a threat by a small neo-Nazi group to come and have a parade through Golders Green, and Ambrosine and I, it's more or less our first job together. We started a group online to go and counter-protest them. And within a day, we had 1,500 people supporting us.
Wow.
And what happened was that the Jewish community leadership jumped on this and decided that they would protest it themselves. But they joined with other groups who were protesting the alt-right, the right wing. And amongst them was a group called Antifa.
Yes.
Now, we all know today what Antifa is. Ambrosine and I had identified them then as anything but anti-fascist. And we said to them, we're not joining with them. We won't stand on the same side as them. So we kept to ourselves. Anyway, ultimately, the government managed to move that parade out of Golders Green, and they had a very small demonstration opposite Downing Street. As a result of that, the Jewish community leadership got together with other communities in the area, and they on the basis that they said that an attack on Jews was an attack on all ethnicities, and they formed a little group called Golders Green Together with rabbis and imams and priests and other members of this diverse community. And they planned to go on the Friday morning to Golders Green and drape Golders Green in green and gold ribbons and have some sort of kumbaya moment between them. And Ambrosine and I decided that was the moment to announce that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and an attack on Jews is anti-Semitism. It's not an attack on all ethnicities. And we bought some bunting and Israeli flags, and we hopped along to Golders Green 2 hours before they got there, and we draped the clock tower in Israeli flags, and we had our megaphone. And the community in the Golders Green Hippodrome then was a Christian community, and they came and supported us. They were a Christian community mainly from Africa.
Right.
And they came to join us. And I remember my MP, I won't name him, but my MP said, he came to that little shindig they had, and he walked up to me and he said to me, Sharon, this is not a place to have a protest like this. He said, we have long fought to separate anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. And I said to him, I'm sorry, but you can't, because they're one and the same things. And the reason I'm going into this long story is that he said to me that this is what they were told, or how they are schooled from the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Board of Deputies. He said, who else must we believe? So you're asking me what I would do. I would ask MPs across the country, I would ask government, people in government, to please have their knowledge search a little bit wider than the official representatives of the Jewish community, because like every community, the Jewish community is very diverse. We have the whole color bar, we have people from all over the world, and we have different political thoughts. And sadly, our Jewish leadership leans to the left. So this is a problem for many Jews like me. I'm not a socialist, and I can say that. Nothing to do with living here. I'm just not a socialist, and that's a discussion for another time. So what would I do? I would ask the government to listen to the smaller groups of people. If they get a letter from a little group like us, we're not a huge group. We don't have finance. We're on social media. That's how we function.
Can you explain that? How do people follow you, Sharon?
Okay, they follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, increasingly on Telegram, on Gab, on more of the spread of social media, Instagram and so on, but mainly on Facebook and Twitter. But we spend a lot of time on social media, because that's where
Campaign for Truth with a
Campaign for Truth, yes.
With a digit 4, is it in the middle?
Digit 4 in the middle, yeah.
And the other one is Eye on Antisemitism.
Eye on Antisemitism, yeah. I've given you all the links if you want to put them up on the comments. If you stick them up there, people can get them. So if you ask me what I would do, I would ask them to listen more carefully to people who have a different view to the mainstream, because sometimes Ambrosine and I are on social media all the time. Ambrosine in particular is an expert on social media. She's been following these groups. She goes into their chat rooms. She asks them questions. She's got videos of them. You've seen her video of I forget his name, the Christian preacher.
You know, I mean, Ambrosine,
yes.
The video, didn't she, of the street preacher who
Absolutely.
got arrested? Yes.
It's still doing the rounds on Twitter. It's up to 3 or 4 million viewings.
Wow.
You know, it's still doing the rounds. And what happened was, she was driving along one day and she skidded to a halt because she saw this man being harassed by the police, and she filmed it. And then she phoned me and said, what should we do? And I said, call you. So she called you and she clipped it and she put it on social media. So I just wanted to say,
because if she hadn't videoed it, nobody would have known. Right,
nobody would have known, exactly.
And, you know, or perhaps a complaint would have been made, but we wouldn't have been able to prove how it happened and what had happened. You know,
but more than that, is
apologise for that arrest, didn't they? So, you know,
they had to apologise for it and for the lies they told.
Yes, because they did lie about it. You're right. Yeah.
They did lie about it, because he had the bus ticket to prove where he'd been. Yeah. So the point is that what happened, what a small group like us have done, is we highlighted something that now's got a bit of legs. People are beginning to talk about preachers being harassed by authority, and that only was harassed because some guy had come across who objected to Christianity. I presume he was a Muslim. I've seen him, but I don't know his name. So
he was accused of Islamophobia, I think, wasn't he?
Yeah. So
not that that's a crime, you know. Not that do you know? I mean, you know, criticizing Islam is not a crime, you know.
Of course, it's not. It shouldn't be. We live in the West. We're still free to speak, I hope.
Yeah.
You know?
So that's not grounds for arresting someone.
I don't think so. And you know, I started my lobbying, just to go back a bit. I started my lobbying, asking the Christian community why they don't speak up. I didn't start lobbying for Jews. I had noticed that whenever a Christian community was attacked in Africa, across the world, anywhere, there was a silence. The church never spoke up. There was the Barnabas Trust. That probably I used to follow it, but they ruined Patrick's reputation as well because he was talking too much and bringing out too much information. So I used to write to my then MP and ask him, why aren't you speaking about this? Because I had this idea that if the Christian community would speak up, the West would be stable and they would leave Jews alone. That's really what I thought. They wouldn't need a scapegoat of Jews in order to destroy the West, because we would be so strong, because you guys would be standing up for who you are. And I know Christian Concern and Revelation TV, my friends there, do stand up, but it's a small group if you think about it.
Well, John Winlow's put in with a comment here, sadly, the historic Christian church has fostered anti-Semitism by insisting that the Jews killed Jesus. You know, we've seen that in the past, thus targeting the Jewish people for pogroms and the Holocaust. You know, we know, sadly, Martin Luther, you know, he had anti-Semitic beliefs and writings. And, you know, we do need to be careful about saying that, you know, anti-Semitism is always a problem out there, and that it has been a problem for us in the church as well. Historically, I guess as we how do you think we should be addressing that within the church and looking at our history or speaking into it now as Christians? Well,
so Ben, yes, you know, I think that is something to be concerned about. It's a shame and a disgrace on the church that there's been anti-Semitism in the church. There's no grounds for it in the Bible. I think even the popes all declared the Jews should not be blamed for the crucifixion, and you can't draw that conclusion out of the Bible. Of course, Jesus was a Jew. The Bible was written almost exclusively by Jews, and the Bible clearly condemns racism of any kind, and in particular, anti-Semitism would be included in that. So, you know, there's no real basis for it in biblical Christianity at all. But sadly, there is some legacy of it, like you say, in Martin Luther and some of the other historical Christians as well, and even some contemporary Christians as well, sadly. But, you know, as Sharon knows, evangelical churches tend to be, you know, not racist, always, hopefully, are not racist and not anti-Semitic. And that's certainly what we should be, and wanting to support and highlight and you know, draw alongside our Jewish friends very much, particularly when we see these alarming things happening in schools across the country and on the streets of London. And you know, we need to talk about it, we need to highlight it, and we need to get our politicians to take action about it. And that's absolutely something that we should do, and a duty that the Bible imposes on us, I think, to love our Jewish brothers and sisters.
Yeah, certainly. Sharon, a final comment that you'd want to say to Christians and the church in how we can be speaking into this as an issue.
Okay, so firstly, I want to thank our Christian friends, because we work with the local Christian fellowship in Temple Fortune, who have given us space where the Jewish community will not give us space. Wow. So I want to thank our Christian friends for being there and for supporting us and giving us comfort. So I don't want what I say to be taken that I'm against my Christian friends. However, I think that there is work to be done, because we've got groups of Christian denominations who are grossly anti-Semitic. We've got, for instance, I said to you that the church at St. James's Piccadilly, which has held events that propagate this idea of the Palestine brand. And I haven't even begun to touch on the rest of it, because it's not just the Palestine brand, it's now Black Lives Matter brand that's involved in it. So behind those brands is a drive to destroy Western democracy. And you asked before about what is this link between Islam and the left wing. And the idea that globalization is the idea. We've got the caliphate on one hand, and we've got socialism that doesn't believe in nation states. And so they've got a similar drive, although they've got a different end game.
Yeah.
And the thing is, where is this end game going? Who's ultimately going to win it? I am hoping that Western democracy will win it. I'm hoping that we will be able to persuade enough in your community and enough in my community to actually maintain what we have, what we fought for, what our ancestors died for, to give us this freedom to live in a democratic country or democratic Western or democratic world. And I'm afraid to tell these people who don't believe in nation states and don't believe in religion and don't believe in a higher spiritual authority, I'm afraid to tell them that at the end of the day, it's the we who belong to that section of the world that actually provides the bread baskets, that provides the technology that drives the world. And they need to pay attention to that, because if you've traveled around the world and you've seen how poor people live, we don't want to go back there. We want to bring them here or bring them forward to actually enjoy a life where they can be healthy and have food and have a home, have a place to go, have a community to love. And if we allow this drive of the Palestine brand and now increasingly the Black Lives Matter, cancel culture, critical race theory, to go into our schools and to change the way, to take away history, to basically destroy history, so we've got no past that we can use to go forward into the future. If we allow this to happen, I'm afraid there's nowhere for the world to be.
Sharon, I wrote a review of that book, The Virtue of Nationalism, by Yoram Hazony. You probably know of that book, maybe you've read it. But it's worth sort of people perhaps looking at that, because he argues the case for nation states having their own individual freedoms and responsibilities and relationships with each other and all of that kind of thing, which is obviously a biblical idea. It goes right back to Genesis. That idea as well, and is foundational to where we are. And I totally agree with what you're saying on those things. And thank you very much for joining us on this, Sharon.
And it's heartbreaking hearing those stories. I don't know if everyone heard all those horrible stories that you're hearing and seeing of people being, those parading in the streets, declaring wanting to rape Jewish women and all these things. It's heartbreaking to see, and I guess it's sad that many people just don't know that these things are going on. We don't hear about these things in the media, and it's heartbreaking that is happening. So thank you so much, Sharon, for coming on and sharing that, and thank you so much, Tim. I guess we the ultimate hope that we ultimately can have is ultimately in Christ, and we know that He's the one that unites all peoples together to Himself and to one another. But sadly, Christians and the church in the past have failed to do that. But we must seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God, and proclaim Christ to all peoples, that they may know His love and grace and forgiveness. Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us, and thank you all so much for joining us. Some big announcements coming up this Monday. A great event with Dr. Peter Saunders of the International Christian Medics Dental Association. Our next Gospel Issue seminar will be on should Christians support the right to die, looking at the issues of euthanasia, assisted suicide, assisted dying, which is going to be a major discussion in the public discourse over these next few months as it continues to be pushed, continue campaigns to legalize helping people kill themselves. So that's should Christians support the right to die. This is this coming Monday, 8 p.m. Gospel Issue Seminar with Dr. Peter Saunders. And then on Wednesday, 28th of June, our next Church Unlocked live stream with special guest Canon J. John, looking at what has COVID meant for evangelism. That'll be an exciting, illuminating discussion. Church Unlocked, that's Wednesday, the 28th of June. What has COVID meant for evangelism with special guest Canon J. John. That's at 7 p.m. Would love to see you at those two events, and do keep your eyes out for many more events coming up. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today, and Tim, thank you so much, and thank you, guests, and we'll see you next week on Round the Table.
Thanks, Ben.